Welcome to the Resolve 105 course. My name is Andrew Ballas and I'll be your instructor. In previous courses, we've looked at tools for color grading individual shots. In this course, we'll explore a variety of tools that can help you when grading an entire project. We'll look at something called versions, which allow you to store different variations of a look. We'll look at working with gallery stills, a way to store an image of a shot that you can reference while grading other shots of the same scene or other parts of a program. We'll learn how to use the grade on one shot as the starting point for grading other shots by copying grading information from one shot to others. We'll also look at how to group clips together to grade multiple shots simultaneously, and we'll even look at a feature called split screen mode, which can aid you in a number of different ways while grading the different shots of the program. In the first set of tutorials next, we'll explore versions. In this next tutorial, we'll start to explore versions. And versions are a way of storing different variations of a look that you can store with a shot in the timeline and then switch between as you need. To start off with, we've already got a shot here that's got a basic grade. And let's say we like this look, but we wanted to explore and create a different variation of it. So I'm going to go up to the color menu, and I want you to notice there's a section for versions. And one of my options is to add version. The keyboard shortcut on a Mac is Command Y, and on a PC, Control Y. Now, as soon as I choose this, I want to pay attention to directly underneath the thumbnail and the timeline. You'll now notice that unlike other shots next to it, this shot now says version 2. So by default, every shot has a version 1, but unless you store multiple versions, you won't see any numbering system associated with the shot. Now, version 2 looks pretty similar to version 1. So what's happening here? Well, when you create a new version, it duplicates the original look that you had on the first version. So in other words, it's a starting point for what you're doing next. Let's say on this next version, version 2, I go ahead and create a new node, a new serial node. And on this node, let's say that what we wanted to do was go for a warmer variation of the look. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of warmth into the midtones and a little bit into the highlights as well. And let's say another variation that we wanted to make to this shot was to add a vignette. So I'm going to go ahead and add another serial node, and I'm going to add a circular power window that is going to shade and darken just the outside edges of the frame a bit. And I'm going to do that by bringing down the highlights and the mid-tone somewhat. And so that's version 2. Now let's say we wanted to explore even further. So I'm going to go ahead and create a version 3. So I'm going to go back to the color menu and choose Add Version. Now again, each time you create a new version, whatever is the active version is the starting point for the new version. Now just to go a little bit more stylized here, let's say that we wanted to try something on version 3 that was really extreme. So I'm going to go ahead and add another serial node. And let's say in this particular case, we're going to go really extreme. I'm going to really crush down the shadows substantially and really bring up the gain and make this kind of really high contrast. But then I'm also going to pull back on overall saturation substantially. That was a little too much. So we've got this really high contrast look that is very muted. Now that we've got 3 different versions, how do we switch between them so that we can see the different looks that we created? Now, I can go back to the color menu, and I want you to notice that there are options to switch to the previous version or the next version. So there's also keyboard shortcuts associated with these. Command B to go to the previous version on a Mac, or Control B on a PC. And to switch to the next version, it would be Command N on a Mac or Control N on a PC. So I'm going to use the keyboard shortcuts here and press Command B, and I want you to notice before I do this that in the timeline you'll notice that the name switches to version 2 as well as we'll switch to whatever nodes were used in version 2. So I'm going to press Command B, and now notice we switched to the version 2 look. I'm going to press Command B again and switch to version 1. Now I think I want to switch to version 2 again, so now I'm going to press Command N and Command N again, and we get to version 3. Now, by the way, since there's only 3 versions, I could keep pressing Command N and it'll just cycle through, in this case, going back to version 1. So I could just keep pressing Command N to cycle through the different versions. In the next tutorial, let's explore how to manage your different versions. In the previous tutorial, we looked at creating and switching between versions, but there's also other options that we have with versions, and we're going to be able to access them by right-clicking on a clip that has multiple versions. So I'm going to right-click on this timeline clip, and you'll notice up near the top there is something called local versions, and actually right below it I want you to notice there's something called remote versions. So there's actually 2 completely different categories of versions. Now this is something we'll explore in a later tutorial, but for now it's enough to know that when you're in one type of mode or another, if you're working with local versions, or what's also called local grades, whenever you create a new version, you will create another version in the same category. So since we're working with local versions, I'm going to keep creating new local versions. If I put my cursor across from any one of these versions, I want you to notice that there's different options. For example, maybe we want to completely delete a specific version altogether. What you can do is go to a specific version, choose Delete. And in this case, let's say we did want to get rid of that version. So now you'll notice if I right-click back in, there's only version 1 and version 3. So it didn't rename version 3, so it's keeping the same naming convention if that's going to help you out. But another thing you can do to manage your versions is not just delete versions that you know you definitely don't want to use anymore, but you could also potentially rename versions. So maybe version 3, for example, I wanted to rename, and I'm just going to call this something simple. Let's say it's high contrast, and I'll go ahead and save that. So I want you to know that when you do rename a version, you do see that naming convention down in the timeline, as well as when you right-click, you'll see that naming up there as well. In the next tutorial, we'll explore deeper this whole idea of local versions versus remote versions, and why you might want to choose to work with one as opposed to another. In this tutorial and the next several tutorials, we'll explore working with local and remote grades. If I right-click over any clip in the timeline, whether it's the active shot or any other shot, and right-click, I want you to notice that there's actually 3 different options related to grades and categories of grades, I should say more specifically. There's something called local grades or remote grades, and the ability to copy from remote grades to local grades, which is something we'll definitely explore in a later tutorial. But for right now, I want to explore just what is a local grade and what is a remote grade. Now this is a timeline-based setting. Even though I'm right-clicking over a specific clip, what I'm about to do by choosing one or the other is switch the entire timeline. Now before I do this, right now I want you to notice that I'm using local versions of grades. As you could tell, there's a check mark across from the grade that's active, and in fact there's actually other shots in this timeline that have also been graded. Since if I right-click on any shot, we have the option to switch between local grades and remote grades, and it is a timeline-based setting as opposed to a clip-based setting. You'll notice that if I switch, right now I'm using local grades, and I switch to this other option called Use Remote Grades, the entire timeline seems to have changed. And in fact, you'll notice that no shots are color graded anymore. Now, it's not that they're not color graded, it's just that they don't have any remote grades, but they do have local grades. So if I right-click on a clip again and choose the other option, in this case I choose to go back to local grades, you'll notice that I go back to seeing all the shots that were graded locally. Now, because this is a timeline-based setting, this is something that's generally chosen before you start a project. And in fact, it's a really good idea to choose this setting before you start a project. And in a following tutorial, we'll explore a workflow for why you might start with one mode or another. But in this tutorial, let's explore just the differences between local and remote grades. Now, right now we're in local grades, and the chief difference between local grades and remote grades is that every single shot in a timeline is completely separate and independent from any other shot. So if I was to get to this particular shot in the timeline of these hands and I started to grade it, whatever I did to this shot, now I'm going to go really extreme just to show some changes. In the timeline, we'll see this in the thumbnail, you'll notice there's no other shot in the timeline that looks similar because I was just working on this one shot. Now I'm going to go ahead and reset that. On the other hand, if I right-click over a thumbnail and I choose to use remote grades, now something very different has happened. When you start clicking on shots, sometimes you're going to notice that above the thumbnail in the timeline are these little pink arrows. And it's not just on this shot, but we'll find them on other shots in the timeline as well. That's because these particular shots came from the same media file. So whichever one of these three particular shots that I'm over, when I start to grade, so I'm going to make some adjustments so you can see this in action. You'll notice that whatever I do to this one shot, I actually do to all three. So the advantage of working with remote grades is that shots are linked together. You grade one and you grade other shots that come from the same media file. Let's explore more about working with remote grades in the next tutorial. In this next tutorial, let's explore a workflow for working with remote grades. Now, as we discovered in a previous tutorial, if I right-click over any clip in a timeline, I'll find that I'm either using local versions, or again, what's referred to as local grades, or I'm using remote versions. And we could see that right now I am in local versions. And this is a default with DaVinci Resolve. So if we want to change this and we've just started a project, the easiest way to do this is to come into this menu and choose Use Remote Grades. Now, by the way, something that we didn't see earlier, which is important to point out, is that you'll notice that when you're using remote grades, that in the timeline now, on the bottom right, underneath every thumbnail, you'll see a little R in parentheses, meaning that you're using remote grades. If I was to switch back to using local grades, you'll notice that it does not show you under any shot that you are using local grades because it's the default. You will see if you've got multiple versions, as we discussed, you'll see what version number you're on, but you won't see that little symbol indicating which category you're in. Now I'm going to switch back to remote grades and let's discuss more about working in remote grades. Now, if I wanted to work in remote grades, again, one of the benefits, or the main benefit, is that this shot is tied to any other shots that also have these pink arrows. So in this case, it's this wide shot that we cut back to a few different times. Now, by the way, here's a quick tip for you. This doesn't just apply to this one timeline. If you have more than one timeline in a project and it's using this same media file, then when you grade this shot in this timeline, you're not just grading other linked versions of this clip in this timeline, you're grading shots in other timelines as well. So let's say that you decided you wanted to work in remote grades, and I'm going to go ahead and make some adjustments to this shot. Let's say that we decided that we wanted this to be a little bit more contrasty than where it started. So I'm lowering the lift and I'm raising the gain settings. I'm going to bring down the gamma a little bit. And overall, it's a tiny bit too much on the green side for my taste. So I'm going to pull that green out. And I'm also going to add a little bit of warmth into this. So let's say that that was the basic grade that I wanted to start with on this shot. Now, again, because this shot and this shot and this shot were all from the same media file, well, they're all linked together. But here's a situation where if I click on this shot, you'll notice that actually 5 shots in a row, and they could be in different parts of the timeline, are actually all sharing the same media. So even though it was a B-roll shot where they were kind of shooting all kinds of different coverage, they were shooting the woman's close-up as she was kind of lying with her eyes closed. They were also shooting close-ups of, her nails being done, and a close-up of another woman that is actually doing the nails, and close-ups of other detail as well. Well, this is all happening in one shot. And it's very possible that we want to be able to grade these shots differently from one another. So let's say, for example, I decided to make this shot a little higher contrast. I'm going to lower lift and raise gain a bit, lower the midtones, and get that little bit of green out, and add some warmth to the shot in both the midtones and the highlights. Now, let's say that we do click on another shot and we realize that although it was working well on this shot, that this angle was just enough different that we wanted to change things a little bit. Well, one of the ways that you can make these shots separate from one another is to create a new version. So if I go up to the color menu right now and choose Add Version, you'll notice now that all those 5 shots now say that they've got very specific versions. Now, all the original shots that were not over, or I should say the non-active shots, are on version 1. But the shot that I'm on is in version 2. And maybe on this particular shot, I wanted to bring up the midtones a little bit and the highlights. And now, because the shots are on different versions, even though they're all remote grades, they're different versions from one another. So I'm able to grade the shot of this woman completely separately than the shot of this woman. Now, another important thing to cover about remote grades is that you may want to start in remote grades, but finish in local grades. At any point while you're working, you can right-click over any shot in the timeline and choose this option, not just use local or remote grades, but the option to copy remote grades to local. You can't start in local grades and then copy them to remote, but you can copy remote grades to local. And what happens if I choose this option right now is you'll notice that those little red arrows that were showing various shots that were connected to one another went away. Because if I right-click over any shot right now, you'll notice that what used to be a remote version has been copied over into local versions, and the entire timeline is in local mode. Now, the advantage to this would be that this allows you to fine-tune any shot and be able to make sure that you don't accidentally readjust other shots that are still linked to it. So that's a way we can use local grades and remote grades in the same project. In this tutorial, let's explore a project setting that changes the default when you do create new timelines, or I should say, whenever new clips are added to a timeline, whether they're going to work in local or remote grades. So if we go down into the project settings, into the gear button, and I click on the color tab, I want you to notice the option all the way up here at the top that says use local version for new clips in timeline. But if you want to use remote grades, then you'll want to uncheck this box, click apply, and then go ahead and close the window. Now, you'll notice in this particular timeline, it didn't actually change anything. You'll know if you're using remote grades because there'll be that little R that's in parentheses underneath the thumbnail for every shot. So what then did that setting change? Well, because this timeline has already been created, it won't affect this timeline. But if I create another new timeline, then it will affect that one. So the best time to choose the setting is before you start bringing media into a project and conforming timelines. In this tutorial and the following tutorials, we'll explore how to work with gallery stills. And gallery stills are reference images that you take of a particular shot, and you can then pull it up as a reference and a guide while you're grading other shots in the film. Let's take a look at some of the basics. In this tutorial, we'll look at how to save and also display different gallery stills. In order to save a gallery still, first move your playhead anywhere in the shot where you want to take the still from. For example, maybe we like this reference with the arm up because it matches something that we're going to be utilizing in other shots. So with my playhead on this particular frame, I'm going to go up to the View menu and down to Stills, and there's an option here called Grab Still. And as soon as I choose it, we've now got our first gallery still, and I can use this slider to resize all the stills that are in the gallery. Right now we've only got one. Now, one of the things that you might use gallery stills for is kind of how we already have a few looks applied in this particular timeline. That you may be setting certain looks in different scenes, and you now want to store those looks so that you can reference them while grading other shots of the same scenes. So I'm going to go to this particular shot, and now I'm going to start using the keyboard shortcut to store a still. The keyboard shortcut to store a still is Command-Option-G on a Mac or Control-Alt-G on a PC. And now I've stored that still, and I'm going to move to the next shot that I graded and store this one, Command-Option-G, and keep moving along until I've stored, let's say, the various shots that I've worked on. Now, typically, I would store the still as I'm working on the shot, or I should say, after I've completed working on the shot, so I can immediately utilize it in other places in the timeline. And one more to grab. So now we've got 6 reference stills, and we want to be able to call them back up while grading other shots in the sequence. So for example, let's say that I went to this particular shot and I wanted to work on it. So I wanted to reference this particular still in the gallery. So you single click on the still that you want to display, go to the View menu, down to Stills, and choose Play Still, or the keyboard shortcut Command-Option-F on a Mac, or Control-Alt-F on a PC. And you'll notice that this brings it up as a split screen. Now you can put your cursor anywhere in the window and click or drag, and you can move that split screen wherever you'd like to place it. Press Command-Option-F and you turn off the split screen again and go back to viewing the shot that you're working on. Now you can go anywhere you want to in the sequence, and at any time pull up any reference still, again by single clicking on the still that you want to bring up, Command-Option-F. Now, by the way, if you don't turn off the still and you navigate to other shots, you'll notice that other shots appear on the one side of the split screen. So the still appears on one side and the shot that you are working on appears on the other side. Now, while you're in this mode, you can start to grade. So if you do start working on something, you're going to leave the still alone, but you're going to grade the shot that is the active shot in the timeline. In the next tutorial, let's explore more about working with stills. In the last tutorial, we explored how to save and display different gallery stills. In this tutorial, let's explore more about working with stills and what your different wipe options are and how that might help you while grading other shots. So let's say that you've already started grading a shot, as I've done in this case. But I want to reference this other shot in the timeline so that while I'm grading this shot, I can see what I'm trying to match to. Now, I've already stored a still of that wide shot, and again, all I need to do is single click on it and press Command-Option-F to bring up a split screen of that reference still. Now, we already saw that you can wipe the still left or right, but you'll notice as soon as you turn on the wipe options that there's now new buttons at the top of the screen. Now, the ones that would help in this particular case are either this button, which would be for a horizontal wipe, which is what we're currently in, or this button to take us into a vertical wipe. So you might use these buttons as a way to try and display certain parts of the images so that you can see what you want simultaneously in both shots. Now, you've also got options in the View menu. Notice you have the option to invert the wipe. so that the reference still just swap positions. And in this particular case, if you wanted to see the two shots side by side where you're seeing the same woman's face, this might be advantageous. And now I can pick up and drag this split screen to maybe reveal just what I want to about each side. I'm going to go back into the View menu and invert the wipe again and show you a different way to explore working with reference stills. And this is to not use split screen at all, and instead take your reference still and drag the wipe all the way over until your wipe is literally filling the frame, or I should say that your reference image is filling the frame completely. So now if I press Command Option F on the keyboard, I switch off the reference still, press Command Option F, and I turn on a full frame of the reference still. Now you might say, well, isn't it much more helpful to have a split screen available? I personally think that when you're working with stills, you want to see the images change the way the audience would see them, which would be the audience won't be seeing a split screen. They'll see one image after another. And this gives you a way to see whether you think that the cut might work or not. Now, these two shots aren't directly up against one another, but it can still be a very helpful way to see if the match is working. So I'm going to press Command Option F again to turn off the wipe. Now I've already got a grade started, but I purposely made it a little bit off just so that we could see how to make this work. Now, if I press Command Option F on and off, one of the things that we'll notice is that this shot looks a little brighter and the color balance seems a little bit different. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bring down the shadows, and I think the midtones a little bit, but I'm going to leave the highlights up. And now I'm going to press Command Option F again to wipe on and off and see if it feels like a better match. Now it still looks like it needs some work to be done. So I think I'm going to bring down the highlights a little bit, and I'm going to change the overall warmth of the shot to make it a little bit more of kind of a yellowish warmth as opposed to the kind of pinkish warmth that we were looking at just a moment ago. So now if I press Command Option F, I can see what the match would look like with this new variation of a grade. And you would keep working in the same direction until you found a match that felt appropriate. So again, remember, you can always turn back on a split screen by using Command Option F and then dragging the wipe across the screen to wherever you want it. So if you do want to see a combination of both images, or you just want to see one or the other, you've got your options. When working with reference stills, there is a project setting that affects how wiping the image across the screen works. Let's take a look. If I hit Command Option F, we know that this will take us into a split screen of our current shot and whatever the current gallery still is. Now, if we drag this border of our reference against our current image, if we reach the left side of the screen and we keep dragging, I want you to notice that it keeps wiping around to the other side of the screen. So this is another way of inverting the wipe if you don't want to actually turn on invert wipe. Now, this is a preference that you may like or not like for whatever reason. For example, if you always want to be able to just move this all the way to the left side of the screen to have it fill the frame, well, it starts kind of reappearing on the other side. So if you want to disable the action for having this wipe go from one side of the frame to the other, we can change this in the project settings. If I go into the project settings from the gear button, and I go to the General Options tab, I want you to notice there's an option that's on by default called Wipe Wraps when viewing reference stills. So if you turn this option off and then apply, you'll notice now when you wipe a still, it hits one side of the screen and just can't go any further. So this is a preference that depends on how you are going to find that you like to work with stills, but be aware that it is an option. In the next tutorial, we'll take a look at working with multiple stills pages. When working with gallery stills, it's often helpful to be able to categorize and organize your stills into different stills pages. So for example, right now, I've got 6 different stills stored that are looks for the different scenes of this particular timeline. And maybe that's all I want to use this particular stills page for. So for example, let's say I started working on another shot, and this was a shot that belongs to a scene that I've already stored a still for. And I want to store this still because I do want to use it as a reference for working on other shots. So I hit Command-Option-G, and it stores the still. The problem is that maybe I wanted these 6 original stills left alone, and I wanted to store this elsewhere. So you'll notice that to the left side of the gallery is something that says Stills 1. This means that we're working with Stills page 1. And that down below it, just above the timeline, is a little plus and minus button for adding or deleting still pages. So if I click the plus button to add a stills page, notice we now have Stills 2. And you can rename these pages. So for example, if I double click into the name across from Stills 1, I'm going to rename this, let's say, Looks. And then for Stills 2, this might be just a generic page that's used to store various shots that I store stills from throughout the timeline. Now in this particular case though, I've already stored a still in this particular stills page that I actually wanted in a different stills page. The good news is that you can pick up stills and drag them between pages. So I just pick up that still, drag it, and it's now on stills page 2. You can actually drag multiple stills that way. So if you select one still and then Command click on a Mac or Control click on a PC, you can select any number of discontinuous stills, or Shift click to select a range of stills in a row and click and drag from one stills page to another. So it's very simple to be able to pick up stills and move them from one page to another and be able to create any number of stills pages to use however you see fit. In the next tutorial, let's continue to explore working with gallery stills and the different flexibility that you have, or the different options that you have when you do store stills. In this tutorial, let's take a look at some additional options for working with stills, as well as allowing you some flexibility to work in different ways. For example, let's say that we're working on this particular shot. Now this shot, let's say you've already stored a still for, but you decided that you wanted to experiment and try and take the shot in a different direction. So let's say a new serial node was added, and then you decided to, let's say, open up the highlights. You wanted to make it look like it was a lot brighter than the previous version. Now, if you go ahead and store a still right now, you'll notice that it does not delete the original one, it just stores a new one. Now, if this is a little hard to tell the difference between the two, let's go really dramatic. I'm going to make this really off the charts blue just so we'll be able to see this when we store the still. So you'll notice that every time you press Command-Option-G, it stores a still for a shot, whether there's already a still there or not. Now this could be to your advantage. It may be that you want to do this because instead of working with versions, you want to use gallery stills as a way to store different variations of a look. Now, if you wanted to do that, you could also name this. So you could click underneath the number for a particular shot and then type something in. I'm just going to type some gibberish just to show you that you can type in a name, and then just hit enter to escape out. Click underneath the still, blah, 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 blah. Now these are obviously not very helpful names, but you could name things in ways that are very helpful if it's a look that you haven't really decided on yet and maybe you want to store different ideas to come back to later. There is another way to work though, where every time you take a still, it gets rid of any previous stills that were stored for that particular shot and replaces them with just the latest one you're storing. Now I'm going to delete this node that I created a moment ago, and I'm just going to kind of finalize this shot a little bit. I'm just going to open it up a little bit more in the midtones, maybe sharpen the shadows just a little bit, but I kind of like where it is right now. And I don't want to be confused by seeing more than one still of this shot in the gallery. So I want to make sure that whenever I store a still, that it gets rid of any previous stills that were stored for that particular shot. And you can do that by changing the preference for this particular page. So for any stills page, you can right-click in a blank spot, and there's an option labeled 1 still per scene. So if I choose that and go back in there, you'll notice there's now a check mark across from it. And I go back to my other stills page, you'll notice it's not checked there. So this is something that can definitely be done on a page-by-page basis. Now, if I press Command Option G right now, you'll notice that those 3 stills that were previously there got deleted and got replaced by the new still. So you can name stills and create multiple versions of stills, or you can right-click and choose only 1 still per scene and make sure that when you save a still, it's the only one that gets saved. In this next tutorial, let's look at how to grab multiple stills for the entire timeline or only for parts of the timeline where you haven't yet grabbed stills. So let's say at this point you've graded the entire timeline, and as you were working, you were definitely grabbing some stills, but you didn't end up grabbing stills from every single shot in the timeline. And at this point, you want to make sure that you have a reference to every single shot. Now, I'm going to start by adding a new stills page, and let's just take a look at what this would look like or how this would work if you're starting with just a blank stills page, either because you deleted stills or had never taken a single still at all. Or as in this case, because you just created a new stills page, and on this page, you wanted a repository for every graded shot in the timeline. If I put my cursor over the viewer window and right-click, I want you to notice there's an option called Grab All Stills. And there's basically 2 different options here. When you choose to grab all stills, are you grabbing it from the first frame or from the middle frame? Now this is a pretty cool option because there's a lot of times when the first frame isn't really very representative of the shot. So if you choose from middle frame, that you know that you haven't gotten somebody before they've entered the door or just after they've crossed out of the frame, you know from middle frame will be somewhere in the middle of the action. So I'm going to choose that right now. And you can see that it's grabbing a still from every graded shot in the sequence, actually from every shot in the sequence, whether it's been graded or not. What if, on the other hand, we had already grabbed some stills and we only wanted to grab the stills that hadn't been taken yet? In this case, we want to grab what's called missing stills. So here I've moved back to a stills page that I've used already. And I'm going to right-click into it and make sure that only 1 still per scene is turned on. And I'm going to go over to the viewer window, right-click, and we already saw Grab All Stills. This time we're going to choose Grab Missing Stills. And again, just like with Grab All Stills, we've got an option. Do we want to grab it from first frame or middle frame? And I'm going to choose from middle frame and start the process. Now in this case, it now grabbed whatever stills hadn't been taken the first time around, and so now we've got a reference to all the different shots in our timeline, stills that were previously taken as well as stills that we just took. Next, let's explore another important thing about working with gallery stills, which is that although we've been spending a lot of time looking at how to store stills, there's definitely going to be times when you're going to want to get rid of stills. So let's take a look at how to delete stills. Now, if I simply single-click on a still and press the delete key, I can remove a still. Now, do be aware that that's not an undoable action. So if you want that still again, you're going to have to go and find that shot and go back and take a new still. Okay, so what if we want to get rid of more than 1 still? So if I'm on a Mac, I can click on 1 still, hold down the Command key, and click on stills that are not necessarily right next to one another. If I'm on a PC, I can hold down the Control key and do the same. Now I'm going to widen out the gallery window for a minute just so we could see more side by side. So click on a still and Command click on the various stills that you want to get rid of. And once they're all selected, press the delete key. Now you can also Shift select if you want to grab everything that's in a row. So if you click on 1 still and then Shift click on another still, you select everything in between on a Mac or a PC. And now with everything selected, press delete. Now another handy way of doing this is sometimes you want to delete all the stills in an individual page. Now there's a couple different ways you could approach this. You could either delete the entire page, which we'll look at in a moment, or you can select one still on the page and then press Command A on a Mac for select all, or Control A on a PC for select all. And once everything's selected, delete. Now, the other way to do this is sometimes you want to just get rid of an entire stills page. It may have been used as kind of like a scratch pad for testing out different ideas, and now you just simply want to get rid of this page altogether. So with the page selected, you can press this minus button, and you're now prompted whether you want to delete this entire still page. And if you choose delete, the stills page is gone. In the next tutorial, let's explore bringing in stills from other projects. In this next tutorial, let's explore how we can actually bring in stills that we've taken in other projects. Now, there's a couple important reasons for this. One of them is something that we're about to start exploring in the next tutorials, which is how you can copy the grades that you've done on one shot to other shots. And stills actually hold color grading information. So sometimes you'll want to pull them from one project to another if you want to have access to that color grade information. So to start off with, I'm starting with a project where no shots have been graded, but I have set looks for this project in a different project. So I need to pull those stills into this current project. Now in the gallery at the very bottom, you'll notice this little arrow button, and if I hover my cursor over it, it says Gallery View. And if I click on it, it opens up the expanded Gallery View window. Now in the upper left corner, I want you to note that at the very top it says DaVinci Resolve Looks. So there are certain looks that DaVinci Resolve ships with that you could utilize, but more importantly for our purposes, I want to point to what's below. You will see a line item for any database that DaVinci Resolve is accessing. And if I twirl down the arrow across from that database, I'm going to see the different users that are in that database. And if I twirl down the arrow across from the AB user, which is where I've created a variety of different projects, and I scroll down, we're going to see a list of any projects that I had created in this particular user. I want you to also notice that there's a couple that say folder next to them, because you can also store projects in folders for organizational purposes. And so I have a folder here called Among Us, or Among Us folder. Didn't need to say folder, but it was just helpful to see that. And if I twirl it down, we'll see that there's actually several projects inside here. Now, I want to pull from the one that says Among Us Initial Looks. So if I just single click on that, it's going to pull up any stills pages that I had created in that particular project. So in this particular project, I had only had one stills page, but if I had more, we'd see them all listed here. And what I want to do is I want to bring whatever stills from this project, from the project Among Us Initial Looks, into our current project. And the current project is this window down here at the bottom. So I'm going to either command click or shift click to grab whatever range of stills I want. In this case, I'm just going to grab everything. So I've highlighted all these stills, and now I'm just simply going to drag into the bottom part of the window. Now, as soon as they're here, and I could have created other stills pages from here as well if I didn't want them to go into the generic stills 1 folder or the generic stills 1 page. But now that they're in the project, I can go ahead and close the window. You'll notice in the upper left corner, there is a little X to close the window. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. And now those stills are in our current project, and I can either use them for reference information, or as we're going to start looking at in the following tutorials, how we can copy color grade information out of these stills as well. In this tutorial, we'll explore our last topic for storing stills. And so far, what we've looked at is that we can create multiple different stills pages and use them for whatever purposes we want, but that these stills pages are tied to this particular project. Now we did look that you can go into another project and you can import the stills from another project, but sometimes you want certain shots or looks that are available to any project. You don't need to import them, they're just always available. And that's where something called power grades come in. Now a power grade, or what's referred to as a power grade album, is simply another stills page, but every project you open up will see the same power grades. So for example, if I go to a shot and I'm on just any stills page in this particular project and I hit Command Option G to store a still, well, that still is in this particular project. But if I go to the Power Grade tab and I choose to store a still, now this still is available in any project I open up into. I'll simply see Power Grade 1 in any project and I simply click on it and that still is available to then be pulled up for reference purposes in other projects. Now, starting with DaVinci Resolve 11, you've been given the option of creating multiple power grade albums. And you can do this by right-clicking in a blank spot of the gallery page and choosing Add Power Grade Album from the drop-down menu. Now, you can rename these just simply by double-clicking into, so you could say like, favorite looks, for example. So that's the difference between individual stills pages, just available to one project, or power grades, which are available to any project. Now, one quick last note. Let's say that you were on the stills page when you actually stored a still. Like, for example, I grabbed this still and I realized, you know what, I didn't want it in this project. I actually wanted it to be a power grade still. You can simply just pick it up, grab it, and drag it into one of your power grade albums, and now you've got it where you want it. So if you end up accidentally storing it by example in the wrong album, just like with other stills pages, you can simply just drag and drop it into the power grade album that you want it to be in. In the previous tutorials, we explored a lot about helping you when you're working on not just one shot, but an entire program. And one of those helpful tools, again, was reference stills or gallery stills. In the next tutorials, we're going to explore another valuable asset when matching different shots of a scene to one another or making an entire program feel more cohesive, and that's how we can copy either the entire grade that we did on one shot to others, or how we can copy pieces of these grades from one shot to others. Let's take a look. In this project, there have been a few looks that have been established, and they might serve as a great starting point if we could copy those looks onto other shots. Now, where this is going to work best is when shots were shot under the exact same lighting conditions and exposure and lighting ratios. But sometimes, even when those things are a little bit different, that grade might still be a great starting point. So for example, we've got a shot here where we've got the man in the RV. And we've also got reverses, a close-up on the young woman. And we might want to borrow that grade from the other shot. And here's how you do it. It's nice and quick and simple. All you need to do is, with the shot active that you want to have the grade applied to, you middle click with the mouse on the shot that you want to borrow the grade from. And now this shot has any nodes that were in that original grade. Now in this particular case, there was only one node. And we could see that if we go back and forth between the two shots, maybe it was close, not perfect. In this case, maybe it was a great starting point. So in this case, I might want to add a new node. And in this case, maybe make the shadows a little bit deeper and increase the saturation a little bit. And I think also the shadows are just going a little bit too green there. So we can either use it as a starting point, or in some cases we'll find that it actually works great, period. So for example, I've got this shot here, but I've got others that were shot from the same angle under the same lighting. And so I can middle click on the shot that I want to borrow that correction from, and now this shot has the same correction as the original. We'll find similar scenarios in a couple other places in this timeline. For example, we've got this RV and we see it kind of in an aerial shot from above. But we've also got a closer up version of the shot, and they were shot at very similar times to one another, and there's a good chance that if I middle click on that wider shot where I already set the look, that it either matches exactly what I want or is really close. In the last tutorial, we looked at that you can borrow the color correction from one shot in the timeline to another by using the middle mouse button and middle clicking on the shot that you want to borrow the correction from. Now, another powerful control that you've also got available to you is that you can do the same thing with stills. So for example, I've got a still stored of a particular look, and I'm now on a new shot in the timeline that needs that same look. I can simply go to the gallery still that I stored earlier and middle click on it, and whatever was going on in the color grade when I took that reference still is now applied to this shot as well. And in fact, I've got a different variation of this shot as well, another one that has more nodes. And you'll notice that if I middle click on this other gallery still, you see that I didn't just get one node. Whatever was used to create that original look to begin with is now there when I middle click on that still. So in the exact same way that timeline shots work, where you can copy all the nodes from one timeline shot to another, you can do the same thing with gallery stills. Now, we've explored the similarity between copying grades from timeline clips as well as copying grades from stills. But there is an advantage, or I should say an extra bit of functionality with stills that's not available when copying grades from timeline clips. So now we already know that you can navigate to any timeline clip and you can middle click on another shot to be able to borrow its correction. And you could do the same thing from a gallery still. Now I'm going to reset the shot to show you another way that you could approach this. If there were multiple shots in the timeline that needed the same grade applied, then you could select the first one and then start command clicking all the additional shots that would need that same correction. So I've got now 3 shots selected in the timeline, and if I middle click on the still in the gallery, I applied that same grade to those 3 different shots. So if you do need a grade to apply to multiple shots, then gallery stills is definitely the way to do it. But if you're just borrowing the correction from one shot to another, then stills and timeline clips will behave the same. Now, there's another reason that gallery stills are also very helpful. And although we just looked at that you can grab the entire grade from a still, in the next tutorial we'll start exploring that you can also just grab whatever parts of the grade you want from one still to different shots in your timeline. In the previous 2 tutorials, we explored how you can borrow the look from one shot to others, either by copying the grade from another timeline clip or by copying the grade from a stored gallery still. But there are times when you're only going to want pieces of the grade that was done on one shot to apply to others. So let's take a look. I've got a good scenario set up right now. On this particular shot, this wide shot, there were 3 nodes that made up the final look. If I press Option D on the keyboard on a Mac or Alt D on a keyboard for a PC, we'll turn off the entire grade. Now, node 1 was the base grade, and node 2 was a vignette that just slightly darkened the edges of the frame, and node 3 was used to overall warm the scene up a bit. Now, if I went to this other shot right here, I've got a good starting point for this. And we might say, well, can't we just borrow the entire grade either from the stored still or from this other shot? And yes, we definitely can. If I middle click on this gallery still right now, I will apply those 3 nodes. The problem is that's not the look that I was going for. I needed a different base correction on this shot. So I'm going to go up to the Edit menu and choose Undo, and show you a different way that we can approach grabbing just what we need from a grade from another shot. If I put my cursor over a gallery still and right click, one of my options is Display Node Graph. And what we'll see is it brings up this window and shows the different nodes that were used in that particular grade when the still was stored. And I can either apply everything just simply by middle clicking on the still, but if I display the node graph, I can actually only grab the things that I want. For example, if I want the vignette, I'm going to just grab this node that's in the node graph, drag it out to my current shots node graph and put it right over the connector line until I see that little green plus sign and drop it, and I've now added the same vignette that was on the wide shot to this shot. And let's say I also want that warmth as well. So I'm going to grab node 3 and drag that out to the node graph of the current shot. So I was able in this case to be able to pull out only the nodes that I wanted and use them in whatever way works best for the particular situation that you're in. In the next tutorial, let's explore what your options are when you do copy grades from either timeline clips or from gallery stills, that you do have a way of controlling exactly what gets copied. So far, we've looked at that you can copy entire grades by middle clicking on other timeline clips or on gallery stills, or you can display the node graph of gallery stills and only pull out certain nodes. But there is other control that you'll want when copying grades from one shot to another. So in this particular case, I've got this wide shot aerial view, and I want to apply this same look to this other shot in the timeline. We already know that I can go to another shot in the timeline or to a gallery still and middle click. So if I middle click on this other shot in the timeline right now, I'm going to get its grade. But I also just got something else. Now I'm going to reset this grade just so that we could see what else also changed aside from the look. Somehow when I was applying the look from the other shot, the shot also got reframed. And that's because on this other shot, there was something done to the shot called input sizing. The shot was pushed in on or zoomed in on using something called input sizing. Now, although you don't see it on any individual node, when you do middle click on another timeline clip or on a gallery still, there are other kind of hidden settings that when you middle click, you will grab that other information that you may not want as well. So in this particular case, I did want this look, but I didn't want the input sizing. So I'm going to reset, and let's take a look at what your options are for controlling just what kinds of settings get applied when you middle click on stills or when you middle click on timeline shots. And we actually do this from the gallery window. If I go into the gallery window and right click, I want you to notice down near the bottom of the drop-down menu, there's a bunch of options called Copy, Grade, Preserve. And what is it preserving? So let's say we choose Copy, Grade, Preserve Input Sizing. Now, even though I just right-clicked in the gallery to access that option, if I right-click again, you'll notice there's now a check mark next to that option. Even though I chose it in the gallery, it applies when you're middle clicking on either timeline clips or gallery stills. So now if I go and middle click on the wider aerial view, this time I get the look, but I don't get the sizing information. And the same thing would have happened if I had middle clicked on a gallery still. You'll find this is also helpful when working with raw-based footage like red footage, when sometimes you may or may not want to pull the actual camera raw settings as you're copying the grade from one shot to others. The point is, you've got options. So if you want to make sure that you only are pulling the nodes, then you can check across from whatever options you want to say preserve, like preserve camera raw settings or preserve input sizing settings. In the next tutorial, let's explore displaying the node graph for timeline shots, not just gallery stills. As we explored in an earlier tutorial, you can right-click over gallery stills to display the node graph, and this allows you to access the individual nodes that made up that particular grade for copying out to the current shot. On the other hand, you don't need to do this just from gallery stills. You can also display the node graph of shots directly in the timeline. Now, if I right-click over a clip in the timeline, notice there is an option, Display Node Graph. And it shows me all the nodes in this particular shot, and I could then apply just what I wanted to other shots in the timeline as needed. I'm going to exit out of the window to show you just one little caveat with this feature. In order to be able to access the node graph for a particular timeline shot, that shot cannot be the active shot or the current shot. So for example, if I click on the wide shot and then right click, you'll notice there is no option in the drop-down menu for Display Node Graph. So I have to be on another shot, and then I can right-click on the shot that I want to grab the node graph for, Display Node Graph, and now I do have that option available to me. In the next tutorial, let's explore Lightbox View and how that might be helpful when working on the grades for different shots in a program. In this tutorial, let's explore working in Lightbox View, which is another way that you can display the user interface, and you may find it helpful for all sorts of reasons while you're working on a program. Let's take a look and explore how Lightbox View works. Now, toward the bottom right side of the timeline, you'll see a bunch of buttons, and this one right here will take us into Lightbox. Now, as soon as we switch into Lightbox View, what we're looking at is a thumbnail for every shot in the timeline. Now, because this isn't very long of a timeline, it's not really filling up the screen. But if you're working with at least a 20-minute long timeline or so, you might have 400 or more cuts, then this window would fill up pretty quickly. But however many shots you're working with, I want you to notice in the bottom right corner of the window is a slider. So you can resize the thumbnails to whatever helps you out. Now, for one reason that you might go into Lightbox View, it's just a different layout of your timeline, and it allows you to navigate to different parts of your timeline very quickly. Now, you might say, but yeah, how can I see them? Well, hopefully you are working in conjunction with an external monitor. So this just became more of kind of a page of your timeline. And if you wanted to, you could even bring up the color controls while you're in this view. Notice at the bottom of the window, there's an option labeled Show Color Controls. And if I click on it, it brings up the controls that we might want to adjust if we're working with a mouse. Now, another use of Lightbox View is, especially when working on long scenes, you'll come back to the same shots, let's say the same certain reverses or over the shoulders or close-ups over and over throughout the course of a particular timeline. For example, we have the man in the RV, and he shows up multiple different times, and this way we see as many of those shots kind of laid out in a row. Now, I've already graded one of these shots of him, and I now want to take this one particular grade and use this as a starting point for his other shots. And because I'm in Lightbox View, it's very easy to see where those other shots are. And so notice I can navigate to another shot, and then middle click on the shot that I want to grab the grade from. Go to another shot, middle click, another shot, middle click. So you might also just find this a more efficient way of kind of propagating the looks from one shot to other similar shots throughout a program. In the next tutorial, let's explore our final topic related to copying grades, and it's another method that you might use in place of some of the things that we've already looked at, and that's something called memories. In this next tutorial, let's explore another way that you can save your grade to then apply to other shots. Now, what we're going to look at next is something called memories. And a memory is something that you'll find at the top of your stills pages. There's these little boxes, and if I drag this little border line, you'll notice there's actually a bunch of them. They're lettered from A to Z, and you can basically store all of those with different stills. Now, those stills contain color grade information just like gallery stills. In fact, they're no different than gallery stills, except that they can be applied and saved with keyboard shortcuts in a way that's just a little bit maybe more efficient than using gallery stills. especially if you're using a control panel which has buttons for working with memories, or you really like using keyboard shortcuts. Let's take a look at how this feature works. To start off with, if I want to store something as a memory, I can go up to the color menu and down to memories, and I want you to notice there's options for save or load memories. So save memory A through H on a Mac would be option 1 through option 8, or on a PC, alt 1 through alt 8. And then you can load or apply those memories to other shots on a Mac with command 1 through command 8, or on a PC, control 1 through control 8. So I'm going to go ahead and store something into memory A. And we could see that there's now a still stored up in memory A. And if I go to another shot that I want to apply that still to, or I should say apply that memory to, I could now either go back to the color menu and down to memories and choose to load that memory, or I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut command 1. And we might find that this was a good starting point for this particular shot, especially since these were shot from a very similar angle to one another and similar lighting. Now you might also just simply find this a more efficient way of being able to store a look, and then as you navigate through the timeline, be able to then apply that look to different shots as you get to them. For example, storing a memory for a wide shot, storing a memory for one direction of coverage, and storing a memory for different direction of coverage. In this case, I'll show you how this feature works with the different shots of this man. So I've already got one shot of him graded, and I want to store this as a memory. Now, the good news is, let's say you forget your keyboard shortcuts for storing a memory, or you had just simply stored it as a still first. I'm going to go ahead and store it as a still. So we see that the still is loaded up here, and previously, apparently, I also stored another still from this same shot. But we've got a still that I just saved, and instead of storing it as a still, you decide, well, you know what, I actually wanted to store that as a memory. The good news is you can simply just pick it up and drag it into the memory section, and now it's also a memory. And if you want, you can then delete it from being a still, but you could have it as both a still and a memory. All right, so there's a couple different ways that we can store memories, but to apply them, we would simply go to different shots in the timeline and say, oh, I know this is memory B, so I'm going to use the keyboard shortcut command 2 and apply that same memory. Go to the next shot as I approach it in the timeline. Oh yeah, this also needs that same correction, and command 2, and so on. One last thing about memories. You can always right-click over a memory and choose to clear it if you do want to get rid of that particular memory. Now that we've explored a whole host of ways that we can copy and save corrections and then apply those corrections to other shots, in the next tutorials, let's explore a feature that began, or I should say was reinvented in version 11 of Resolve, and that's grouping clips together. And let's see how that can be beneficial when working on different shots of a program. In the next tutorials, we'll explore how to grade more than one shot at a time. Overall, you have three options. You can grade the nodes of an individual shot. You can group a selection of clips together and then grade the group as a whole. Or you can create corrections that are applied to the entire timeline. We'll start off in the next tutorial by looking at the difference between clip and timeline corrections. In this next tutorial, let's explore the difference between clip and timeline corrections. Let's say I'm starting with this particular look on this shot and I wanted to make a change. And if I decided to go up to the nodes menu and choose to add a new serial node, whatever change I would make on this node, however small or however drastic that change is, it would only happen on this one shot. Now I'm going to go ahead and delete the node and show you that there are some times that you'll want to grade, a larger group of clips. Well, this is the largest that you can grab, which is affecting the entire timeline. Now, in the upper right corner of the node graph, I want you to notice right now it says clip. Now, if I click into that, there's an option labeled timeline. Now, at this point, it doesn't really look like anything's changed in the interface except that there appears to be no nodes in the node graph. Now, if I do go up to the nodes menu and choose to add a new serial node, I do want to point out, by the way, it does look a little bit different than when we're working with clips. I mean, the node does look similar to other nodes, but it's got this green outline around it as opposed to the orange outline that we normally see with clip grade. So it's kind of a very quick indicator that you're working with the timeline, not individual clips. Now, there might be many different reasons that you might want to apply a correction to an entire timeline, and one example is something referred to as a trim pass, where you've done a grade for an entire timeline based on one particular type of output that you're creating. And now you're creating an output for different purposes, and you want to make an overall adjustment. Now, I still tend to think that you're going to want to make more specific adjustments to scenes and individual clips as well, but let's just take a look at what overall timeline adjustments do. So, for example, if I wanted to create a power window, maybe a vignette, and I'm going to turn on circular power window on this particular shot, and I'm going to make this vignette pretty noticeable so that we can see it. So I'm going to invert this power window. I'm going to hide the overlays just by clicking on a different tab. And I'm going to really substantially bring down the midtones and highlights. Now, because this is a timeline correction, this isn't applied just to this one shot. Any clip I click on in the timeline also has this same vignette applied. Now, if I want to go back to working on the individual nodes of the clip, like maybe, for example, I decided that whatever the timeline correction was affecting this particular shot a little too much, I could go back to the clip tab, and now I have however many nodes were on this original clip. And if I go ahead and add more nodes, let's say I just wanted to brighten up this shot a little bit, I'm going to use gain and gamma a little bit. Well, what I did was just make only an adjustment for this clip. So this node is only on the clip, and if I switch back to timeline, any corrections I make would be applied to the timeline as a whole. In the next tutorial, let's explore working with groups, which is another way of grading multiple clips, but this time a little bit more selective than grading the entire timeline. In this tutorial, let's explore working with groups, specifically how we can create a group from a selection of clips. Now, we've got a scene in this case that has already been graded. And in fact, let's say, for example, this wide shot, the grade was created with one node, and on this shot, for whatever reason, 3 nodes were used to create that particular grade. And each shot has its own unique corrections with its own amount of nodes. But what we want to do is be able to group all of these shots together and make an overall correction that is separate and unique from the clip's individual nodes. So the way to start is to make a selection. Now, I can either click on one clip and then hold down the Command key to select several non-contiguous clips or clips that are not next to one another, or I can Shift select, which is what I'm going to do. And I'm going to select just this range of clips. And I'm going to right click on one of the clips, and I want you to notice that there's an option here called Create New Group. Now, I'm going to keep this somewhat simple. Let's say that this group's name is just simply Outdoor Scene. Now, I'm going to click OK. Now, even if I deselect this selection that I had previously made, these clips are actually kind of ganged together in a sense. Or I should say, actually wrapped in a container called a group. And we could see that these clips are actually part of a group because directly above each particular thumbnail, just to the right, you'll see this little green link. Now, clips that do not have a group, when you click on them, there will be no connections to other clips. But these clips actually are grouped together, and that brings up a whole new set of options. If I go up to the node graph into the upper right corner, I want you to notice now there's actually 4 options. Previously, there used to only be 2, clip and timeline. Now, we can grade the group either by choosing group pre-clip or group post-clip. Now I'm going to keep this somewhat simple, but in a nutshell, basically group pre-clip means that any nodes that you apply happen before any clip corrections. And if you make any group post-clip corrections, any adjustments that you make happen to all the clips after every node that's been applied to the individual clips. Now, in this particular case, let's say that the reason that we were grouping these clips is because we did want to make some overall adjustment to this range of clips. Now, this is actually a great scenario for grouping because these clips already have clip corrections where the clips really match one another somewhat closely. So if I choose group post clip right now, I'll see what looks like just a blank new node graph. But actually, this is a node graph for the group. Let's say, for example, in this particular case, we wanted to do something that overall subtly changed the scene. Now, again, because the clips already somewhat match one another, there's a good chance that if we make some mild or moderate correction, the clips will still match one another. Let's say, for example, we just made some subtle correction. We wanted to bring up the highlights a little bit, maybe bring down the midtones. So in other words, we're making it a little bit more contrasty. And just so we can actually see this a little bit better, let's go a little bit more extreme with color. So I'm going to go into the gamma and add a little bit more warmth into that. Now, if I go to the node that I've made these adjustments on, again, remember we're working in group post clip, and I turn off the node. So this was the original grade of all the shots. But when I turn this on, I didn't just change this shot. We'll notice that any other shot in the timeline now also is being affected by this look. Now, I just actually hit a shot that's not part of the group, so it also doesn't have the same look. So I'm going to go back to one of the shots that do have the look and go back to clip, group post clip, and turn off the look. So we could see that that look, although we set it over one clip, wasn't being applied to just one clip. Now, another thing about working with groups is that although we did group these clips together, the clips do still have independent control. So if I go back up to this menu and I do choose clip, now we can continue re-editing the nodes of individual shots. So for example, let's say for whatever reason we felt that this shot needed some new adjustments, we could add new nodes, change things, and I want to point out that you can even go to the color menu and choose to create new versions. So this shot is now on version 2, and I'm going to do something just very dramatic and crazy off the wall because I just want to point out that although I created new versions, these clips are still linked to one another. So it allows you to make some fine-tuning adjustments to your individual clips. Now, of course, this is a little off the charts than a fine-tuned adjustment. So I'm going to go ahead and reset this particular node, keyboard shortcut Shift Home. And maybe what we decided after we grouped these clips together was actually more of a subtle correction. That I created this new version so that I could try, let's say, pulling back on the warmth on this individual shot. And what I can now do is use Command B on the keyboard to go to the previous version, and now go to Command N to go to the next version. And in this case, obviously, there's even bigger differences between these two versions. But even switching between versions does not break this clip from the group. So you can make clip adjustments, group adjustments, and you can even make multiple versions of individual clips, and they will all stay within the group itself. Now, when you start working with groups, it's important to note that you might also want to add clips to groups as well as remove clips from groups. So let's say I go to this other clip in the timeline and I realize that I accidentally did not add this clip, as well as maybe even a few other clips, into the group that I wanted it to belong to. If I right-click over any clip that I want to add to a particular group, I want you to notice that I can come up to this option called Assign to Group, and that however many groups I've created, they would all be listed here, and I could choose the specific one that I want to add it to. And now this clip is part of that group. And again, these clips do not need to be next to one another. So if I select this clip over here, for example, right-click, Assign to Group, and choose it, So any clip that is in that outdoor scene group, we now see that green link with. Now, by the same token, if you decided for whatever reason you needed to remove a clip from a group, you can right-click over a clip and choose Remove from Group. Now we should expect, of course, that the look is going to change because now the only thing that's being applied to this clip are the individual nodes, in this case node, that made up this particular grade. But any clips that are still in the group still have the group correction applied to it. In the next tutorial, we'll explore another topic, which is working in split screen mode. In the following tutorials, we're going to explore working in something called split screen mode. And split screen mode allows you to view more than one image at a time, both on the internal viewer monitor as well as to your external monitor. Now, in order to get into split screen mode, the first thing we'll want to make sure is at the top of the viewer window from the options button that the option called Show Viewer Options is turned on. Now, if it is, then we'll see these buttons over here to the left side. And if I click this button right here, then we will go into split screen mode. Now, at this point, I am only looking at one image on the screen, but there is kind of a bit of a giveaway that we are in split screen mode, and it's the white border that now showed up around this image. In the following tutorials, we will explore how we can bring up multiple images for different reasons, specifically two different sets of reasons. How we can bring up different looks for the same shot as a way to aid us in choosing the final look for a particular shot. And we'll also look at split screen mode as a way to view multiple different shots in the timeline as a way to aid us in matching a sequence. In this tutorial on working with split screen mode, we'll explore how you can work with split screen as a way to view variations of a look for a particular shot. Now, there's two different ways that we can do this, and one of them has to do with versions. If I click on this clip over here, you'll notice all of a sudden multiple images just showed up in the viewer window. Now, for one, it's because we'd already turned on split screen mode. So if split screen mode is off, we don't see that. But when split screen mode is on, then to the right side of the viewer window, we'll see a drop-down menu. And what we're choosing right now is an option called Versions. And what this means is that if you are on a shot that has more than one version, when you choose versions, you will see the different particular versions you had created. So I apparently have 3 different versions on this shot. If I click on the shot next to it, we'll see that we only have 2 different versions on this shot. And whichever shot you're on, the one that has the white border around it shows you the active version. So if I cycle through versions with Command B or Command N, you'll notice the nodes change in the node graph, as well as you'll see that the white border is around a different image. And so if you exit out of split screen mode, then this is the look that you'd be currently seeing as you navigated to this particular version. Now, a different way of exploring different looks on a shot is, instead of using versions, is to use gallery stills. So I've got a different version of this exact same shot, but this shot only has one version. And instead, different looks were created and saved up here in the gallery as different stills. Now, if I click into split screen mode to turn it on, instead of choosing versions from the drop-down menu, I'm going to choose gallery grades. At this point, whichever still I click on in the gallery, it now shows me what the current look is on the left side and what the particular gallery grade would be on the right side. And this way, I'm able to kind of evaluate different looks against the current look. And whichever one I want to go with, we know how to apply gallery stills to a shot and have it apply that look. I could middle click on that shot. That's now the current look. I could leave split screen mode, and I've found a way of being able to choose different looks for a shot by calling up gallery grades. And that's another use of split screen mode. In the next tutorial, let's explore how you can view multiple different images in the timeline while you're working. Another way to work with split screen mode is to be able to evaluate different shots in the timeline simultaneously. So if I come up to the button for split screen and turn it on, again, we know that we are in split screen mode because we see the white box. And what does that white box stand for? What is the current active shot? Okay, now why does that matter? Because we do have a couple choices, or I should say multiple choices with split screen mode, and there are a couple that are very specifically related to working on more than one shot in a program, or how do the different shots in a program work together. So one of those options is something called neighbor clips. And when you choose neighbor clips, what you see is the current active image, and we can see that it's the current active image because it's got the white border around it. And we see one shot previous here, two shots previous here, and then we also see after the current shot, the first shot after the active shot. So if I use my keyboard shortcuts to navigate to different shots in the timeline, I'm going to use down arrow or up arrow to move to previous or next shots. First, I'm going to start with down arrow. So I hit down arrow once, and I move to the next shot in the timeline, and now neighbor clips updates to show me two shots previous and one shot next. And I can keep moving either forward in the timeline or use up arrow to move back in the timeline. And this is a great way to evaluate whether I want to make any changes. Now, although these shots are matching pretty well, let's take a look at an example of if we decided that we did want to make a change while we were in this mode. So I go to a shot, and let's say, for example, I add a new node. And I'm going to make a very extreme correction just so we could see this. So you'll notice again that whatever is the active shot is the one that gets worked on. Now I'm going to undo that action and move to the next shot in the timeline, and again show you that if I added a new node or made a change to an existing node, what I'd be changing is whatever is the current active shot. Now I'm going to undo that action as well. So neighbor clips is one way to be able to view more than one shot in the timeline at a time. Another way would be to select the shots that you want to view at the same time, which might be all similar close-ups or all similar medium shots. So for example, I do have 3 of these wide shots, and maybe the light was changing while the camera was shooting, and we want to see how well these are matching right now. So I'm going to switch from neighbor clips into selected clips. And I'm going to click on one clip and then hold down the command key to click on the additional shots that I want to add into this mode. So whatever clips you command click on, it just keeps adding them into split screen mode. So you're not limited to just filling 4 images in the screen. And in fact, I can start removing shots from this. If I command click on different shots, I remove them out of split screen mode and only view the images that I do want to compare against one another. Now, by the way, one last note about split screen mode, and it has to do with the white outline as well as your other options for turning on and off your split screen mode in general. If I go to the View menu, I want you to notice that there is an option labeled Split Screen. It may be helpful sometimes not to see this white border. It might be distracting. So in the Split Screen option, there is an option to uncheck Show Outline. So if I uncheck that, then when you're in split screen mode, you don't see the outline. Now you'll also notice from that same menu, Split Screen, here is another way that you can turn on or off split screen mode. And that takes us to the end of the DR105 course. I hope that these features that we've looked at will help you out while you're grading the different shots of a program and make it more efficient and give you the end result that you desire.